The Inquisition was not born in a single moment, but rather evolved over centuries from the early church's attempts to suppress dissent. In the early centuries of Christianity, heresy was often viewed as a spiritual problem to be addressed through debate and persuasion. But as the church grew in power and aligned itself more closely with political authority, heresy became a threat not only to religious orthodoxy but also to social order. By the 12th century, movements like the Cathars and the Waldensians were gaining popularity in parts of Europe, especially southern France. These groups questioned the Church's teachings, its wealth, and its moral authority. The Catholic Church saw them as dangerous heretics whose beliefs could spread and destabilize both the faith and the ruling hierarchy. In response, Pope Lucius III issued a decree in 1184 that marked the formal beginning of the medieval Inquisition. This document, called Ad Abolendum, required bishops to search for heretics and bring them to justice. Unlike earlier, more localized efforts, this marked the start of a more organized and systematic persecution. Over the next decades, inquisitorial methods were formalized, and by the early 13th century, Pope Gregory IX established the Papal Inquisition as a permanent institution. Dominican and Franciscan friars, known for their education and loyalty to Rome, were appointed as inquisitors. These men had broad powers. They could summon suspects, conduct trials, and deliver sentences. They answered directly to the Pope, bypassing local secular authorities, which gave them immense autonomy. The Church framed its actions as acts of mercy, seeking to save souls from eternal damnation. But in practice, the methods were ruthless. Heretics were often arrested without warning, imprisoned without trial, and subjected to psychological and physical torture. The accused were presumed guilty and forced to confess. If they recanted, they might be spared execution but would still face lifelong punishment or exile. If they remained defiant, they could be burned at the stake. The Church claimed it never shed blood. The executions were carried out by secular authorities, but it was the Inquisition that determined guilt and passed the sentence. This grim partnership between church and state gave the Inquisition both divine and legal force. Communities lived in fear. Families turned on each other. Neighbors reported neighbors. Children were encouraged to inform on their parents. The Inquisition's influence spread across Europe, with particularly brutal chapters in France, Italy, and later Spain. It became a tool not only of religious control but also of political repression. Kings and popes used it to silence opponents, eliminate rivals, and consolidate power. The Inquisition was not a single event but a centuries-long system, a machinery of terror cloaked in righteousness. Its foundations were laid not on justice or truth, but on fear, obedience, and the belief that the ends, saving souls, justified any means, however cruel. While the medieval Inquisition had already entrenched itself in various parts of Europe, it was the Spanish Inquisition that would become the most infamous. Established in 1478 by King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile, the Spanish Inquisition had a dual motive: to ensure religious uniformity and to consolidate political power. It was sanctioned by Pope Sixtus IV but operated largely under the control of the Spanish monarchy. This unique arrangement made it a powerful tool not just of faith, but of absolute royal authority. The initial targets were conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. The monarchy viewed them as a threat to national unity and sought to root them out through inquisitorial trials. Tomás de Torquemada, the first Grand Inquisitor, became a symbol of ruthless fanaticism. Under his leadership, thousands were interrogated, tortured, and executed. Trials often took place in secret. The accused were not told who had accused them or what specific evidence existed. They were encouraged to confess and name others. Torture was routine and legally sanctioned. Devices like the strappado, the rack, and the thumbscrew were used to extract confessions. The psychological torment was as severe as the physical. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement, denied legal counsel, and offered false hope of mercy if they confessed. Many confessed to crimes they never committed simply to end their suffering. If convicted, the accused could be subjected to public penance or handed over to secular authorities for execution. One of the most chilling aspects of the Spanish Inquisition was the auto da fe, the act of faith. These were public spectacles in which the condemned were paraded before crowds, forced to wear humiliating garments, and then burned at the stake. Crowds gathered in city squares. Children watched as flames consumed the bodies of heretics. Priests chanted prayers as smoke rose to the heavens. These events were portrayed as victories of faith but were, in truth, grim celebrations of human cruelty. The Inquisition also targeted Protestant reformers, intellectuals, mystics, and anyone whose beliefs deviated from strict orthodoxy. Even books and ideas were not safe. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, a list of banned books, was compiled and enforced. Possession of a forbidden text could lead to trial. Over time, the Inquisition became an institution of fear that stifled thought, creativity, and dissent. Entire communities lived under the shadow of accusation. Wealth and social status offered no protection. Even nobles and clergy were not immune. Many were accused not because of actual heresy but because they posed a threat to those in power or because someone envied their position. Confiscated property enriched the Inquisition and gave it a financial incentive to continue its work. It became a self-perpetuating system of persecution, supported by fear and justified by distorted theology. The Spanish Inquisition endured for more than 3 centuries, officially ending in 1834. But its legacy, the trauma, the silence, the intellectual darkness it imposed, lasted far longer. It was not just a chapter of brutality in Spain's history but a warning to all ages about what happens when power is unchecked, and belief becomes a weapon. The Inquisition's ability to extract confessions was not based on justice or logic but on carefully crafted systems of terror and psychological domination. Torture was central to the process, and it was not only permitted, it was codified, structured, and viewed as necessary for saving souls. Inquisitors were trained to manipulate, deceive, and coerce. The goal was not to discover the truth, but to extract a confession that confirmed the Church's narrative. Once accused, a person was already considered morally guilty. Silence was treated as defiance, and denial was considered further proof of guilt. Trials were held in secret, often without any defense counsel or witnesses in favor of the accused. Family members were sometimes called to testify, not in support, but against their own kin. The accused was forced to answer a list of vague charges while blind to the evidence and unaware of their accusers. If the person remained silent or denied the charges, torture was used under the justification that the pain would awaken a confession and thereby cleanse the soul. The cruelty was precise. The rack stretched limbs until joints popped. The strapado hoisted the body in the air by tied hands and dropped it suddenly. The iron boot crushed bones. Burning, suffocation, dislocation, all were allowed within reasonable limits as long as the accused did not die immediately. Doctors were present during torture not to heal but to ensure the subject stayed alive long enough to confess. Even after confession, punishment did not end. Heretics who repented could still face lifelong imprisonment, forced pilgrimages, loss of property, or exile. Those who refused to recant were handed over to secular authorities for execution, usually by fire. The Church claimed it did not kill, but it passed judgment, and the secular arm merely carried out its deadly command. In many cases, confessions were false. Under excruciating pain, victims confessed to impossible crimes, flying with demons, cursing the Eucharist, or conspiring with Jews, Muslims, or Protestants. Once confessed, the accusations took on legal and theological permanence. The Inquisition also used informants and spies to gather rumors and secrets. Entire networks of surveillance were maintained inside cities and villages. People whispered their prayers in fear. A misspoken word could mean imprisonment. A private doubt expressed in confidence could become public condemnation. Knowledge became dangerous. Books, ideas, even dreams, Anything that deviated from orthodoxy was potential heresy. The Inquisition spread terror by design. It created an atmosphere where fear replaced thought, and obedience replaced truth. Across Europe, its machinery adapted to local contexts. In Italy, the Roman Inquisition pursued scientists and philosophers like Galileo. In Portugal, the Inquisition extended into its colonies, bringing terror to Brazil and Goa. No corner of the Catholic world was untouched. The Inquisition functioned like a vast, theological police state, slow, bureaucratic, and lethal. Generations of inquisitors passed their manuals, strategies, and case studies down through the centuries, creating a legacy not of spiritual enlightenment, but of institutionalized cruelty. While some defenders argue that the number of executions was relatively small compared to later genocides, the real damage lay not just in death, but in the suffocation of human potential, conscience, and freedom. The very idea that salvation could be forced through pain and fear is a contradiction so deep, so dark, that its echo haunts the pages of history to this day. The Inquisition did not limit itself to rooting out popular heresies or persecuting other faiths. It turned its gaze toward intellectuals, mystics, and reformers, anyone whose ideas threatened the Church's authority. In doing so, it became an active enemy of progress, knowledge, and spiritual inquiry. The most famous victim of this war on knowledge was Galileo Galilei. In 1633, the Roman Inquisition tried him for advocating heliocentrism, the idea that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Despite the clear evidence and the growing consensus among scientists, Galileo's views were deemed heretical because they contradicted the literal interpretation of Scripture. He was forced to recant under threat of torture and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Church banned his writings, and only centuries later would it admit its error. But Galileo was not alone. Thinkers, inventors, and philosophers across Catholic Europe feared expressing ideas that could be labeled unorthodox. The result was a chilling effect on science and innovation. Universities operated under strict theological control. Natural philosophy, medicine, and astronomy were taught only within narrow doctrinal limits. Even mysticism and personal spirituality were under suspicion. Christian mystics who claimed direct communion with God, like Meister Eckhart or Teresa of Avila, often walked a fine line. If their teachings deviated from accepted doctrine, they faced investigation. Women were particularly vulnerable. Accusations of heresy often blended with those of witchcraft. The Inquisition did not lead most witch hunts, but its presence fueled the fear that made them possible. Women who were healers, midwives, or who simply lived independently were targets of suspicion. The line between heretic and witch was thin, and torture did not discriminate. The war on thought extended to books and ideas. The index of forbidden books grew steadily. Authors from Erasmus to Descartes found their works censored. Printers were required to submit manuscripts for approval. Secret libraries emerged, where forbidden works were hidden and read in silence. Knowledge became a rebellion, and reading became an act of courage. The Inquisition claimed to protect faith, but it often crushed the very soul of Christianity: love, compassion, and truth. By focusing on control rather than understanding, by choosing punishment over persuasion, it severed faith from reason and poisoned the relationship between the Church and its people. For centuries, people feared not only God, but the men who claimed to speak in His name. Even when the physical flames died, the psychological scars remained. The silence that followed, generations afraid to question, doubt, or explore, was perhaps the greatest tragedy. The Inquisition did not merely kill people. It imprisoned the human spirit. It made thought a crime. It made truth a danger. And in doing so, it dimmed the light of an entire civilization. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the winds of change began to blow across Europe. The Enlightenment challenged the Church's monopoly on truth and authority. Philosophers, scientists, and reformers spoke openly of reason, liberty, and the rights of individuals. Slowly, the moral and political climate began to shift. The Inquisition, which had once been feared and untouchable, now faced criticism not only from outsiders but from within the Catholic world itself. Governments began to question whether such brutality served the interests of justice or faith. Spain, long the heart of inquisitorial power, began to experience pushback from liberal thinkers and reformists who viewed the Inquisition as a stain on national honor and a barrier to progress. The last execution by the Spanish Inquisition took place in 1826, when a schoolteacher named Cayetano Ripoll was hanged for deism, the belief in God without adherence to the Church. His death marked the final flame of centuries of violence in God's name. 8 years later, in 1834, the Spanish crown officially abolished the Inquisition. It had lasted more than 350 years. Other branches, such as the Roman Inquisition, were slowly weakened, restructured, and eventually absorbed into more benign parts of the Vatican's bureaucracy. But the damage was already done. The Inquisition had silenced voices that might have changed the world. It had terrified generations of believers into passive obedience. It had corrupted the meaning of faith, turning it into a tool of tyranny. Even after its formal end, the legacy lingered. In some regions, records of trials were destroyed, but in others, they survived. Thousands of pages of accusations, confessions, and condemnations. These archives reveal not only the cruelty of the system but also the everyday people caught in its web. Artisans, farmers, children, widows, whose only crime was to think differently or speak carelessly. They were swallowed by a system that cared more for conformity than for compassion. The Inquisition is often defended by revisionists who argue that it was not as bad as later atrocities or that it was a product of its time. But such arguments overlook the essential truth. The Inquisition institutionalized spiritual violence. It built courts not for justice but for control. It made God a jailer and the Church a prosecutor. It elevated fear over faith. And it set a precedent that religion could be enforced by terror. This legacy echoed through later centuries. Totalitarian regimes, fascist governments, and ideological tyrannies took note of how power could be maintained through surveillance, accusation, and confession. The machinery of the Inquisition, secrecy, torture, the erosion of personal rights, became a model not just for religious control but for authoritarian systems of all kinds. Even today, debates about religious freedom, freedom of expression, and the role of institutions in moral policing are haunted by the specter of the Inquisition. It remains a symbol, a reminder of what happens when power is cloaked in divine authority and left unchecked. And yet, the very existence of this historical memory is a form of resistance. The voices that were once silenced are now being heard. The stories of the victims are being recovered. The cruelty once hidden in cloisters and dungeons is now exposed in books, museums, and documentaries. Truth has a way of rising, even after centuries of suppression. The Church has, in recent decades, expressed regret for aspects of the Inquisition. Popes have spoken of the pain caused, and some formal apologies have been issued. But history does not forget so easily. The path to forgiveness is paved with truth, not denial. The Inquisition was not just a tragic mistake. It was a deliberate
system of persecution, carried out in the name of purity and righteousness. It offers a dark mirror in which we see the dangers of combining ideology with unchecked power. It shows us how easily faith can be twisted into fanaticism. And it reminds us, painfully, urgently, that the price of silence is always paid by the innocent. The Inquisition is gone, but its lesson remains. True faith does not require fear. True belief does not need chains. And true love, the kind that Christ preached, cannot dwell in the shadow of fire and gallows.
You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.